Hello, fellow things. One thing I really like is handheld video games. Handheld video games are great to let you play video games in the most inappropriate of situations. But sometimes I just want to have a little box that connects to my TV that I could just put the game cartridge in so I could use the TV where I can have as high of a resolution as I want and as big of a picture as I want, depending on my monitor size. When I look at how different these games are between the Game Boy version and the remake. They are kind of different. Of course, this is because the remake will try to fix things that were wrong with the original. Of course, you could always try to play it when it appears on the Virtual Console, but the issue with that is many games are not shown on the Virtual Consoles and sometimes many platforms. For example, the Game Boy Color and Game Boy together have over 2,000 games. The Switch Online Game Boy Color combo thing has 15 of them. So you said we have to release a new video game console and people want old games. Release NES and SNES games again. People love those, and they're easy. But what if your game wasn't actually on that thing? What do you do then? Like, let's say your game was owned by many developers, so the company doesn't have full rights to it, or was controversial, or just wasn't popular, or simply didn't sell well. Then you're out of luck. Some game systems have recovered where they basically just have an adapter to plug into the console. They'll let you play the handheld games from that current generation and sometimes the previous one because game companies want money at the end of the day. The first handheld systems, the Game & Watch series, did not have this because they didn't even have cartridges. All the data for the game was baked into the system. So unless you plug the whole system in, there's no way around it. Look at these games. There's nothing interesting about them. No one wanted to play these on the big screen. This is from a compilation a few years later. Even in the 90s and early 2000s, game companies did not see these as worthwhile as full games. This is the time when they released NES games as their own Game Boy Advance cartridges. The first of these adapters that you play handheld games on a console is the Super Game Boy, which basically let you play games on a big screen in color, and not in the color palette you see here, which is puke and green. The Super Game Boy 2 was also released a few years later, and this is basically the same thing, but now with a link cable, so you can link up a second Game Boy to play multiplayer Game Boy games, with one player getting the big screen and one player having to deal with a non-normal Game Boy, which sucks. The Nintendo 64 had the Y-Boy 64 adapter, which basically allowed for Game Boy and Game Boy Color games to be played on the big screen. This was not used to the general public, not available to them, but was used by the press for things like screenshots and magazines, and was used in tournaments quite often. The real public got the Nintendo 64 transfer pack instead. When used with Pokemon Stadium, this let you play the 3 Pokemon games at the time on the big screen, and that was it. It could also be used for compatibility between Game Boy and the N64, but nothing else. So instead of having a device that could play all the 2,000 plus Game Boy Color games, you got a thing that could play 3 of them. It gave you a little bonus here and there. You also got the Game Boy Player a few years later, which this allowed us to actually play Game Boy Color, and Game Boy Advance games on the TV. It did require a unique disc, so it's really expensive nowadays, just because the disc is really hard to find when it's not scratched up. But at the time, this was probably a great thing. It had a link cable, had multiple different controller methods. You could use a Game Boy Advance as a controller, and 2 different controller things just with the GameCube. You had so many options. This also had some things with compatibility between different games. The Game Boy Player had some limitations though, since some of the Game Boy Advance library could not be played. The most notable of this was the Game Boy video cartridges, because these had a bunch of TV shows on them and movies. So Nintendo didn't want those to be recorded on a VHS tape and just distributed. So they made it so it couldn't be used with the Game Boy Player. There's also a large variety of games that had a gyroscope built in, or something that required motion controls to control the game, which if you wanted to play these on a Game Boy Player, you technically could. You just have to grab the console and tilt it to play these games, which seems really stupid. Oddly enough, the Wii was a console that skipped getting any way to play Game Boy games on it, or even DS games, which is odd simply because the Wii was advertised as a thing that could play all of Nintendo's libraries from all the previous consoles, and it would have made sense to have a Game Boy player for the Wii. While we're on the topic of this, the PlayStation Portable never had a way to play its games on the big screen mainly because Sony would just have the games on it be ported over to the PS2 to keep it alive in the last few years of its life, which is the first few years of the PS3's life. It was a simple and easy way, since PSP was meant to play PS2 like games. Oddly enough, the DS and 3DS didn't have any way to play them on a TV, despite them being Nintendo's best selling systems, with the DS actually having the most sold systems of any Nintendo thing until the Switch came out, having 50 million more than the Wii did. These had a lot of gimmicks in them. So the DS had the touch screens and the two screens. 3DS improved on that by adding its 3D screen and motion controls, although limited. So many games wouldn't work without the touchscreen. So you have to look down at the screen and look back up at the TV repeatedly, which is probably why it wasn't done. Like most of the DS's library relied on touchscreens. Just imagine trying to play DS games without the touchscreen. Why won't my game work? I'm pressing all of the buttons. Some way, the PlayStation TV was a thing released by Sony a few years later, and this was basically a box that could play some PlayStation Vita games, but also had PlayStation Now installed on it, so you could use the subscription service to play PS3 games on a smaller box. This thing could only play some just due to how Sony was at the time, because they realized that they couldn't make their handheld play like a console. They had to make it unique. So the PlayStation Vita was full of so many dumb gimmicks, from microphone, it had Wi-Fi on it for some reason, it had motion controls, 2 touch screens, it had two different cameras as well. Like, this was so full of gimmicks that it's rare for any one game to not use one of the gimmicks. You can also basically mod your system and give it an HDMI port if you really want to play a handheld game on a big screen when it doesn't have an official adapter. The annoying part about this is these are very expensive, and you often have to provide the console as well. So you have to spend a few $100s on a handheld, and a few hundred more. The alternate thing is the aftermarket things, which are basically hardware equivalent or emulated things that can use the official cartridges. The one I have here is Revo K101 Plus. This one is great. It's a hardware equivalent, and it can play all Game Boy Advance games. This thing connects to the TV with basically a headphone jack but smaller, that the other end is component cables. If you want to use this on a capture card or something, you have to get an HDMI converter. But this is a rather compact way to play it. It has like 5-ish hours of battery life, backlit screen, which means it's better than the actual Game Boy Advance for Game Boy Advance games. I actually have this one, and fun fact, this is what I used to record the Minish Cap video, and for any GBA footage used in this video, because I'm too lazy to mod my GBA. There are also aftermarket consoles that let you play Game Boy Color, and Game Boy Advance. Most of these are made by Retron. The Retron 5 is the most famous, with it having Game Boy Color, Game Boy Advance, but also NES, SNES, and Sega Genesis. And it uses the Sega Genesis controller, or a knockoff of it at least, because that is the controller that requires the most buttons out of all of those. You also have one that's basically a slimmed down version with just the handhelds with the SNES controller, because that's the ideal way to play Game Boy Advance games. This is because a lot of the Game Boy Advance's library was ports of SNES games, because the idea of playing the SNES games portably was a big thing back in the day. And a similar thing can be said with the Game Boy and Game Boy Color with NES games, because they were similar power-wise to an NES. There's also an adapter for the Retron 5 which lets you play Sega Master System and Sega Game Gear games. The Sega Master System is a console, but Sega Game Gear is Sega's first and only attempt at a true handheld system. After that, they realized they were not good at it and stuck with their consoles. Another dumb thing you can do is buy an AV output thing for your Game Boy Advance. This lets you play Game Boy Advance games on a big screen. And also Game Boy Color and original Game Boy, but it's $70. And you have to provide the Game Boy Advance and mod it yourself, so at that point just buy a Retron 5. It makes me so angry that of all the handheld games, only those from the Game Boy line can be played with almost the entire library with no caveats, no issues with the games. And that's the most frustrating thing in the world.